listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is a podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week I am in conversation with Dr Farahnaz Karim. Now, Farahnaz is the founder and CEO of Insaan Group, which is an impact investing organisation. She's also, more broadly, got a long track record as a social entrepreneur and also as an academic and political scientist. So on the social entrepreneurship side, she's previously worked with the United Nations, the World Bank and various non-profits around the world, including in Afghanistan, Palestine, Bosnia-Herzegovina, so lots of interesting places. And on the academic side, she's recently completed a doctorate at Exeter University in the UK. Before that, she was a teaching fellow at Harvard for a bit, and she's also been a faculty member at Zayed University in Dubai. She's got a master's in public administration from Harvard and an undergraduate degree from McGill, so she certainly knows what she is talking about. So I sat down relatively recently with Farahnaz to have a really interesting conversation about the work that she does at Insaan Group and more broadly about the kind of wider context for impact investing and what the relationship is between that and philanthropy. So we talked about the work of Insaan Group, we talked about what impact investing is, what the market looks like at the moment, and as I say, kind of what the intersection is between impact investing and philanthropy and how the two can potentially work well together, or whether sometimes they slightly kind of cut across each other so that they're not being additive, and whether that's a challenge. We talked about, on the recipient side, what a focus on entrepreneurship brings in terms of benefits, and whether actually it's merely that it allows you to fund things in a different way or to fund different things, or whether there are actually kind of deeper points about investment relationships or loan relationships being somehow more equitable or having slightly less problematic power dynamics than we sometimes get in gift relationships. We also talked about measurement, which is obviously very important in the field of impact investing, and about some of the challenges of getting away from a solely quantitative view of measurement and trying to get more kind of qualitative elements in there so that we can capture some of the important elements of social value. We also talked about risk and failure and how we understand that in philanthropy and in impact investing. We talked quite a bit about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the sort of merits of those and perhaps the drawbacks of those as a framework, and how Farahnaz has used those in her own work at Insaan Group to try and put them into practice and particularly make them relevant to smaller organisations on the ground. And then we also talked about some of the challenges of trying to balance getting on and working within the field of philanthropy or impact investing with systems as they are now versus trying to drive more fundamental systemic change, and how to kind of balance that tension sometimes between pragmatism and idealism. So without further ado, let's go into the conversation. I should just say very briefly that as I was editing it, I noticed that certainly in the first half, when Farahnaz was speaking, there's a couple of points at which there's a slight click in the audio, which I think must be a loose microphone connection, which I didn't notice at the time. I've done my best to clean that up, so hopefully it's not too invasive, but just to forewarn you about that, but it does go away, I think, certainly towards the second half. So without further ado, let's go into the conversation, and I'll be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Dr Farahnaz Karim. Hi, Farahnaz.
Hello.
And Farahnaz is the founder and CEO of Insaan Group, as you'll have heard in the introduction. It's great to have you on the podcast. Hopefully, we're going to have a really interesting conversation talking all about this kind of intersection of impact investing and philanthropy and how you get money down to the grassroots effectively. But maybe the best place to start is just for you to say a bit about your background and particularly kind of what Insaan Group is for anyone who's not heard of it and how the organization came about.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rodri, for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation. So Insaan Group came about from my field experience. So when I was much younger, I had this dream of becoming UN Secretary General one day. I still have that dream, by the way. And essentially, at a very early age, I knew I wanted to study things related to international relations and development and the big issues of this world. Ended up as a United Nations volunteer, in my mid-20s, supervised elections in Bosnia after the war, and then spent a couple of years between Pakistan and Afghanistan as a United Nations volunteer for UNDP, so basically a UN agency, and doing sort of literacy work and also empowerment work for women in Afghanistan. And this was during, Taliban Afghanistan. And I would say this is kind of my formative experience. And from there on, I worked in Central Asia, ended up by managing a large nonprofit in Afghanistan again at a particular time where the situation was more hopeful. And from all this experience across the humanitarian and development sort of spectrum in the field, in conflict, post-conflict countries, I, woke up one day with the idea of Insaan. So Insaan means human. In a number of languages. And it really is for me and for my team as well, because I'm lucky enough to work with people that have had similar experiences than I have, that are on my board or on my actual team after, 15, 20 years. And I think for all of us, the name really resonates because it is about the essence of humanity and the commonality that we all have, despite the various opportunities that, unfairly separate us. So that's the meaning of Insaan. In a nutshell, Insaan was trying to solve two problems that were clear to me through these experiences in the field of aid and development. The first is a very top-down, supply-driven system that channels capital in very short-term ways and often decontextualized from the realities of the end users or the beneficiaries. That was really one problem in terms of how capital is allocated. And the second problem was the question of metrics. The idea that we're thinking that we're doing good, but in fact, we're blatantly measuring all the wrong things back then. So with these two very simple ideas of capital allocation to local entrepreneurial solutions and pushing our thinking around measurements further, Insaan came to be with the initial and in part support of the Umejir family, founder of eBay, and after that from high net worth individuals and various foundations we work with over the years.
Yeah, that's great. Really interesting to hear and loads to follow up on there. I guess, the first thing I wanted to ask is obviously given that the focus of the work you're doing is, as you say, on supporting entrepreneurs and doing that through kind of investment type approaches, one of the challenges you said you're trying to address is obviously shifting away from a kind of top-down model to one that is more responsive from the ground up to the needs of communities and individuals. What was it about that led you to sort of focus on entrepreneurship and an investment approach in terms of the demand you were seeing? Was that demand very clearly for that kind of funding and those kinds of approaches rather than maybe traditional philanthropic or grant making ones?
Yes, so that's a fantastic question. So perhaps conceptually, I think I'll start by probably laying, what I think, traditional, as you call it, philanthropy would handle this part as part of an overall approach. So, I observed that much of philanthropic funding tends to be identity driven, social proof driven, emotionally driven. Some of it may engage in long-term bets, right? Sort of cancer research type of things or endowments. But what I wanted to do is not necessarily replace all these approaches, which I think are valid in their own right, although some of them can be improved in their delivery mechanisms. But I wanted, as part of that way of thinking about philanthropy, to insert a little slice of the pie for what we call catalytic capital. And the reason why I thought that was important is because rather than deciding as a DFI, as a UN agency, as an international NGO, as a, sort of a foreign-driven entity, what priorities are for these communities, I thought that it was more important to find entrepreneurs that actually emanated from these contexts and understood the challenges and said, hey, I'm going to devote my life trying to solve this problem of access, for example, delivery of good healthcare or delivery of education or safe, places for childcare or safe places for, playgrounds for children. And I felt that those kinds of solutions that were driven by an entrepreneurial spirit were underfunded, undercapitalized, undersupported. And I saw sort of hands-on the cost of not doing that, which is one of the privileges that we have in Western countries, that, ideas can get backed up to innovate and to actually reach those that are underserved by markets and underserved by a system that is imperfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one sort of follow-up on that, because I'm really interested in this, is when we're talking about that intersection of kind of grassroots empowerment and entrepreneurship and investment, do you have any sense as well that from the point of view of those individuals or communities on the grounds, there's actually something preferable about a kind of investment type relationship where it's feasible, as opposed to a more traditional gift relationship? Because one of the criticisms of philanthropy is often that it, even when it's very well intentioned, it's quite paternalistic and disempowering, or can be, and perhaps actually doing things on the basis of investment and entrepreneurship is maybe in a way more honest. I don't know whether that's a slightly loaded term, but do you have a sense in which actually the people on the ground really feel as though they prefer that to accepting a gift?
So, I think that's a fascinating question. And of course, we know all the research on microfinance and, cash transfers and all of this. So, we can take various levels of discourse to answer this question fully. But focusing on the work and the experiential knowledge base that we bring to the table, and trying to keep a balanced approach, because I welcome the critical, lens on what we're doing. I will say that the added value, theoretically, of a markets-based approach that's solving for a problem of, let's say, as an example, access to good, patient-centered, outcome-centered healthcare in slums, which is actually, one of the organizations we've worked with. That problem is, through a markets-based approach, is in a way much more equally served by market mechanisms if done properly. Right, with proper data on health outcomes, number one, proper data on who are we serving, in terms of gender, in terms of children, in terms of tribe, in terms of whatever indicators you want to look at to measure inclusion and diversity, but also the market mechanism that basically gets a patient to rate the service, right? And this rating of the service dimension, I think, is underappreciated. Because that really does level the playing field, because you're moving away from, a pure market-based mechanisms that we have in, some of our economies, to one where we are introducing that system of, are you satisfied as a customer? Is this price point good for you? How many days does it take you to get better? All of the tools that technology and sort of, marketing and market-based mechanisms bring in terms of clarity and equality are being introduced, but not only in this sense, but also within the greater context of, how is this contributing to leveling the playing field in a city, in a county, in a country, right? And so I think that the combination of these things are helpful in some ways. Now, I don't want to be a sort of capitalistic evangelist here, because I do think that we are working in a very imperfect system that we are painfully trying to tweak for the greater good here. So that's my general conceptual, macro lens I'm operating with. And sometimes the market mechanism will not deliver, will under-deliver on its promise, and will simply not reach particular segments of society that can't pay for certain goods, And we see over and over again social entrepreneurs that are disillusioned by having created a for-profit, which never gets funded properly, and then turn to blended capital, turn to non-profit structures because they find it easier to raise capital over a long term. So I don't think in terms of an ecosystem that we've really solved this issue of the right legal structure, the right incentives, the very deep and holistic understanding of who the stakeholder is and where is the power dynamic and its challenges leading us. And I think we're still in a conversation about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to come back in a moment to that question of the relationship between where we see the role of philanthropy and where the potential role of more sort of market-based mechanisms is. Because again, as you say, it's definitely not a sort of either or choice, and actually both are appropriate, often in different contexts. And maybe we don't really understand that as well as we should. I just wanted to ask first on the sort of specific work that you do at Insaan Group, what kind of form are the investments that you're making actually taking? Because again, we sort of talk about impact investing and socially motivated investing, but that covers a huge range of activities. So is it sort of primarily equity-based investment? Is it loan finance? Are they relatively sort of simple loan mechanisms? Or is there a mix of those things?
So there is the theory and there is the reality. So,
yeah.
As you know. So the theory is most of our investments are equity-based. The overwhelming majority of them. And this was done simply because we wanted to bring the rigor of due diligence in our own way of looking at entrepreneurial opportunities. And we wanted to, I'll come back to that in a second, but we also wanted to be a little part of a greater story that would unfold, right? The vision was always that we come early stage, but we know that we will be followed by, or hopefully we think we will be followed by many others. And so we wanted to pave the way for other investors to come. And so that was the logic. In practice, and that took me even a long time to understand that in practice, not only us as a little entity, because we are small and very humble, but that a lot of it is accompanied by a high dose of blended capital, of grant money that comes to the entrepreneurs in the form of awards or prizes, or philanthropic giving, grants giving by a range of foundations or high net worths over the years, and that capital has been instrumental for these startups to be able to plow through these very difficult periods that we've known globally, right? Of COVID, of supply chain breakdowns, of increasing cost of goods, etc., millions of challenges, and not to mention security challenges on the ground and electoral upheavals in some of the countries we work with, and the list goes on. So in practice, it's a fallacy. It's an absolute fallacy in the sector that impact investing is all about private capital. And I'm quite happy to spend time with smart people to, bring data to show this. But it really is a fallacy. If you think of DFIs that are funding a lot of these commercial companies, that DFI is public money, right? So this is linked to the other grand fallacy around financial sustainability, which is kind of the equivalent of the overhead fallacy in the nonprofit sector. The financial sustainability in every startup innovative venture across the world, even in the West, even in, uber capitalistic places is that it's risk capital, and that risk capital is often cushioned by a lot of grant money and free money in the form of accelerators, in the form of pro bono services, in the form of, absolute devotion from angel investors, board members that give of their time, treasure, and talent. So that's the reality, and that needs to be, recognized.
And that's really interesting. I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, and I guess there's that broader sense in which impact investment, certainly, in its current form, is made possible by those other forms of socially motivated funding that are, even more risk tolerant. What's your sense of where whether there are lines that need to be drawn? Because I know there are some instances in which it's more explicit and sort of structures are created which position philanthropic capital as almost kind of first loss capital in order to bring in impact investing. And I personally find that idea somewhat uncomfortable, in that I worry that it's sort of, whether it is using the motivations of sort of philanthropic funders in order to make something that otherwise wouldn't be feasible as an impact investment feasible, and whether it is sustainable. If it's kind of catalytic and leads to a situation in the future where that becomes a sort of viable investment, that's fine. But if it's only ever viable if you have a layer of philanthropic money, is that genuinely moving anything forward? I mean, what's your sense there of some of the sort of potential challenges?
I think that's a fantastic question. So if I build on my previous point, right, that we are living in this fallacy that those boundaries, right, between private, public, and let's call it philanthropic or non-profit, right, philanthropic capital are hermetically sealed. They are not. They are not. So if we break that initial construct, and in fact, that's the first barrier, is not recognizing that, in fact, the ecosystem would work way better if we understood that, in fact, capital is flowing across these pillars very seamlessly, in fact, right? Taxpayer money that's behind DFIs, invest in commercial entities. A lot of them benefit from, philanthropic money in various forms, which, I've alluded to. So if you start from the premise that, in fact, it's not so clear cut in the first place, and because we are talking about not just financial capital in the form of money, but we are also talking about human capital in terms of expertise and networks. And we are also talking about technological capital to embed efficiency in some of the models that are sort of emerging. So if you're looking at it in this way, it's naturally blended. But if we go back to the way the sector talks about it generally, then I would say that overall, there is an advantage of not looking at philanthropy in general that should be moving towards impact investing or catalytic capital in particular. Well, what do we mean, first of all, by catalytic capital for our audience? It's risk capital, essentially, right? Think of it as VC money, right? But VC money for a more equal world, or a more sort of, or a less unequal world, let's say, if we're looking at, sort of global flows of capital from, to let's say Sub-Saharan Africa and India. So risk capital for innovation tends to be concessionary and long-term oriented. So if we're looking at this definition of catalytic capital, then and you're not necessarily saying this is a panacea, right? You're saying this is one particular pillar or slice of the bigger pizza, let's say, right? That is philanthropic capital, which can continue to be what it is, right? Identity, emotional, social proof, long bets driven. But within that pie of, let's say, a philanthropic portfolio allocation, within that pie, if a percentage of it could be growing, that would be fantastic to actually provide entrepreneurs with a little bit more room to maneuver. Because the situation at the moment, and this is the risk of not having that catalytic capital, and I'll come back to that catalytic capital in a minute. But the risk of not having that catalytic capital is that impact investors who are motivated by, if you look at the definition of impact investors, they're motivated by, an intentional investment that seeks financial returns alongside environmental and social returns. But because it's alongside, they're looking, I wouldn't say primarily, but very often primarily financial returns. So if you're looking at primarily, well, alongside in theory, primarily, in reality, they're basically either paying lip service to environmental and social returns. This is a provocative statement, or they are clearly looking for a winning horse, right? And with all the language that goes with it, and this would be fascinating to to do a little bit of discourse analysis on. It's really fascinating language, unicorn, etc., zebras and others. But so the problem is, if you're taking that impact investing lens, what does that mean? It means that naturally you're going to be attracted to those that pass due diligence that pretty much guarantees a fairly good, fairly not too long time frame before return. And that means you're naturally going to be attracted to lucrative markets yet again, even in those regions of the world. If you're in India, you're going to be attracted to states or particular sectors that are, sexier than others. Same thing in sub-Saharan Africa. That's why 80% of the capital has been going to 4 countries. So again, larger markets, more mature markets within that, upper societal segments of society, within that tech products that have or delivery applications that have the power to be transformative in a sort of a faster time frame. And again, you're going towards the default lens of capitalistic incentives, which is pretty much guaranteed to lead to further inequality in the medium to long term. So this is why the rationale for catalytic capital, concessionary capital, where philanthropy is best placed, again, not holistically, because I agree with you, it's not a panacea, but a percentage of our portfolio should be directed there to prevent that and for us to diversify to, education, health, supply chains, service delivery offerings that actually are going to be serving those who are marginalized from the system in the first place, those where the impact invested capital will not go to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so is Adam, so the level of the overall impact investment market is part of the problem then that, I guess if you can think of things along a spectrum from social return to financial return, where you've got kind of fully commercial at one end and then philanthropic giving at the other, that at the moment too much of what we see in impact investing comes from the finance end and just sort of allows a little bit of social or environmental concern to come in, but finance and financial return is still dominating. And what we don't have nearly enough of is money that has started from the philanthropic end but has applied investment approaches and investment principles, and that would be the space within which you would find the sort of catalytic philanthropy or impact investment that might address, as you're saying, some of these things that are in kind of less immediately profitable markets and slightly thornier problems.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And this is why, in Insaan we spent, much of our time to do three things, right? To, number one, do the work. Because unless you've actually built a portfolio, you don't know, number one, the challenges that entrepreneurs go through. So it's easy to pontificate, but it's not that easy to actually do the work of going to the field, doing the due diligence, understanding the reality that the entrepreneurs deal with day in, day out, and understand who are the clients, right? Who are the end users, and how is their life improving? How do we measure that? Are metrics valid? Right? Do they tell the full story? What does it mean for these entrepreneurs to try to scale these businesses when they have to spend, more than half of their time, these, amazing change makers, in the nonprofit, for-profit structures that are out there in the world devoting decades of their life. And, is it fair that they spend half of their time trying to raise money and understand the complexity of the simplified narratives that are floating around, while being disillusioned with how much time it actually takes to raise capital, any type of capital? Because that's another fallacy, is it's not going to be one type of capital, as I mentioned before, because it is in reality blended capital. But it's also not a one-time fundraise. It will be many rounds of fundraising if, an entrepreneur is successful. And that means you can understand the amount of time that goes into, and stress, I really mean stress for the business, stress for the employees, and mental stress for these entrepreneurs, and which we don't talk about enough. But over a number of years, to actually try to solve a problem that's very real, which could be proper access to healthcare in slums, which could be compostable sanitary pads in India, 100% compostable sanitary pads, and try to work not only to raise the money to grow their ventures, but also to compete in a world where, the odds are not in their favor, because these are not lucrative markets to begin with. And also you're facing essentially, funders that will tell you, well, put your costs down and make money very quickly. But then what marketing costs are like in today's digital world. So that's to give you, the reality of some of our investments.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One other thing I wanted to ask, you mentioned sort of a couple of times, and it's clearly very important to your work, is around getting the right focus on kind of metrics and measurement to understand the impact that you're having. And I was very struck by one thing that I read that you'd written about the fact that is important, but in doing so, we need to make sure we're not just relying on quantitative data, because that doesn't really tell the full story that you want to capture often about these organizations and entrepreneurs, and that we also need to take into account qualitative data. Could you say a bit more about kind of what kinds of things you're thinking of in terms of that qualitative data and what that might look like in practice?
Yes, and it makes me think of a great story. But when I was in my last posting in Afghanistan, did some work on this amazing development program that was handled by the government with the World Bank and the government, Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. It was called National Solidarity Program, and it was all about community-based sort of priorities that would be set at the village level. Right. And so we were, some of the NGOs working on it. And then eventually I was working to supervise some of this and monitor some of this program. But we're going to the field and getting these village elders to define their own priorities, and from there derive, the metrics of change. And it was really interesting because at that time, I worked really closely with a colleague of mine who's, now on our board. And we spent a lot of time thinking about this issue of qualitative metrics. And in one of these water and sanitation, I think it was like a sort of a well project, the metric, and we used to say the metric of change, the qualitative metric of change needs to come from the end user in their own words and in their own language, not concocted in a boardroom. So it shouldn't be, how much water is that hand pump going to deliver? But it needs to be, well, how does this change the life of, generally it tends to be a woman or a young girl who fetches the water. And so we went out, to the field, and I remember the stories of empowerment were really the story. We used to laugh because it was like, well, that's the right metric. And it was someone saying, this is great because I get to leave the house to go fetch water, and that gives me a break from my mother-in-law for a couple of hours. And it was like, that was the metric of change. And so you'd be surprised that in fact, when you start listening to the voices of the end users, you have a very different sense of the reality of their day-to-day life and what a particular project or intervention means to them. So in Insaan, what we've tried to do is go to the field to capture the voices of the end users. So sit for a whole day in one of the clinics that we funded and really look at the patients and who are they, first of all, and then ask them, and then capture sort of video footage on this. But in the last couple of years, we've basically tried to think about the best way to scale what we're doing rather than raise money, make an investment, and do it again and again and again. And looking at the fact that we're very small and in the greater scheme of needs, everything is very small. And so we built the first version of a platform called Impact Footprint, it's impactfootprint.org, to feature innovations to meet the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we really focused initially on, basic data, but tried to put a context note around each of the metrics that we've had based on our research, where no one wants to, be judged by a number, because a number may or may not mean anything, as we know from a lot of these, sort of platforms that judge entities by overhead expenses, which is, completely ridiculous. And so we wanted to, first of all, put these context notes and let the entrepreneurs tell the story in a way that makes sense to them. It's their story that should be showcased. But what we'd like to do in the next iteration of it is embed qualitative data in the form of these videos, testimonials from the end users, but maybe geospatial data, but also reviews. And that really came to sort of my mind one time where we had gone to India to interview students who had just graduated from this amazing organization called Yanshala. And we followed them over 4 years as a project with a great pro bono sort of partners of ours, videography partners, analog production. And we used to go every year to the field and try to find the same students year after year after year. And then eventually we did this video of this lovely girl called Amisha, who said, well, I'm now a therapist, and, I studied, health, and now I have my own practice, and, I came from nowhere in the slum, and this is where I am. And she told her story, and we posted the video on Instagram. And a few months later, she replied on Instagram herself and said, by the way, everyone, thank you for liking this post. It's me. I'm real. And I really did go to this program and loved it. And I just thought to myself, well, look at this. We have, Deliveroo that asks us if we like our food. Wait, why don't we start using the end users if they like their experience? Why don't we now begin finally with all these tools to go straight to capture the reviews from them, testimonials from them, in audio, video, geospatial data, but also basic, sort of reviews like this, where we have an endorsement, right, a verification that this is real.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating idea, and I think huge potential there, as you say, in that increasingly the technology is there, both to kind of capture that qualitative data in the first place, and then to analyze it and sort of turn it into other forms that serve different purposes. I wanted to ask, actually, because you mentioned there in the context of that, the work you've done on Impact Footprint, and in passing you mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And it sort of strikes me that that's really interesting because, at one end of the spectrum, you're talking about trying to understand impact from the point of view of the ground up, from the individual and how it affects their life, and starting from that point. And then almost right at the other end of the scale, you've got this huge framework of kind of, agreed goals and priorities and ways of measuring them that sort of set at the UN level. Do you, in that work you do, I mean, do you think one of the challenges that we have, I mean, with the SDGs, I guess, is that because they do exist at that scale, often nothing is filling that gap in between what it means to the individual or the organization on the ground and how they understand their own work, and this framework that has been designed to be of relevance to kind of huge INGOs and governmental funders, and that actually the sort of work you're trying to do in essentially almost kind of translating between those two things, is really important, because that's the only way that you kind of get people to do the work that's going to deliver towards the SDGs, or to understand how work they're already doing might be contributing to them.
I think that's such a great point. And, in using the UN SDGs, there's of course, as a lot of people call some of it SDG washing and all of this, because the translation of these goals can be, as you say, a little bit opaque. So I think it's a great question. Let me try to first address it conceptually. So I told you a little bit, my own background. I think that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced the MDGs and which will probably be replaced in 2030 by a successor acronym of some sort, hopefully when we'll have made some progress on these ones. I think they are phenomenal. And I think they are phenomenal because it's not that easy to capture the globality of challenges that we face as a human species and beyond. And I think in that sense, they are very global in nature, intrinsically equalizing in their intent, and stakeholder diversifying, for lack of a better word. And what I mean by that is, of course, the starting point is government, right? So the 193 or I don't know how many we have these days, governments. So it's meant to be that global dashboard so that governments are aligned towards something that makes sense. Obviously, we're failing on some of them. I'll just start with UN SDG 16 as the point of failure, atrocious failure. And that's my personal perspective, obviously, because I have a background in political science as well. And I find this absolutely heartbreaking on a daily basis. So, but SDG 16, I would say, is if I had to rank the goals with SDG G1 on poverty probably should be at the forefront of our priorities on a daily basis, and the others are all linked to them. So they are interlinked, and in that sense, and they are ambitious, and in that sense, they seem to be hard to pin down, but actually they are meant to be used by a variety of stakeholders, from governments to then corporations, of course, asset managers, and all the way down to NGOs and civil society organizations, etc. So I think they are, if used properly and not overly diluted, I think they can be extremely useful to, first of all, say, this is the primary SDG that we focus on, right? Because in a way, they're all interlinked. So all of them could be gender, and which should be mainstreamed by now. And all of them should be climate, which should be mainstreamed by now. But of course, certain particular ventures, if we come down to the work that we're doing, focus on one aspect in general that is prevalent, which could be health or education or, biodiversity, etc., renewable energy, etc. So they're useful in that sense. You're right. If we overboard on targets and metrics, we can get lost again into a bureaucratic exercise. And we want to stay away from anything that will take us back to, something that becomes meaningless very quickly. A bureaucratic checklist, or worse, a checklist that actually doesn't link back to the real metrics of change that we've just talked about. But I think that if we're able, and we've started, and we've debated this in our team a lot, and also researched it through gazillion interviews with stakeholders over the years. But in the first version of Impact Footprint, we decided to just focus on one, and then really link a mission statement to a theory of change, and then from there derive a couple of KPIs or metrics that can be then standardized with the great standards that have been put into place in the last few years. And again, the standardization is not necessarily something that needs to be very harshly driven, but it would just help us propel the sector forward to say, what are we talking about when we're talking about increase in, income for artisans, for instance, as a metric, or patient satisfaction in a healthcare venture, or learning outcomes in an educational ventures. It's just to give us a little bit of standardization in terms of saying, well, are we really moving the needle for those markets or that were underserved, or these areas that were, sort of never touched by capital to enable scale. So in that sense, if you are, I think, approaching them with cautious, not to deter smaller innovators or those that may not have the means to develop very sophisticated impact system. And if you contextualize them, not to be punishing, and to reflect the reality and operational reality of the field. And if you accompany them with qualitative metrics that are meaningful, that we just discussed, video, audio, geospatial, testimonial type of metrics, and there may be many more, then I think you can really use them to show a story of change that is real.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, even if the SDGs are an imperfect tool, I mean, as you say, the fact that we have that framework and it has been agreed between so many parties with kind of competing interests and worldviews is itself a remarkable achievement. And so they do, I think, have huge value. I could keep talking about the SDGs for ages, but I'm aware that we're coming up on the hour. And I just wanted to ask one final question. It's a relatively big one. I should warn you in that in quite a few of the things that I've read that you've written, you talk quite a lot about the importance of thinking of sort of genuinely new economic models or societal models, and around ideas of things like donut economics and some of the other kind of ideas similarly that have been put forward. In terms of the work that you do, how much of it do you see as kind of working within the existing system to sort of fundamentally change the system? And do you find that a challenge at all? I mean, I sort of ask because it's a conversation within the philanthropy world, certainly, about whether, the extent to which philanthropy is a kind of reflection of the system that's created it, and whether its ability to sort of fundamentally challenge that system is therefore limited. And I wondered if in the work that you do that sits more at the intersection of philanthropy and sort of investment and kind of entrepreneurial models, whether you felt as though you had more capacity to use that work to sort of drive genuine transformative change.
I mean, that's a phenomenal question. And in a way, it's a question about, are you more effective within a system or outside a system? I started my work within the greater system of these large institutions to understand how they work, and picked the entrepreneurial route to have that flexibility, right, to work with. So, I mean, the advantages of the entrepreneurial route is that you have the benefit of thinking freely and doing thought leadership pieces that some people read, and I'm so happy you read them. And so you're a free thinker in a way, and you chart your own path with people you like, and that's really a luxury. And it's people you like in your team, in your board, the people who fund you, and the partners that you choose, the corporate partners, etc. So in a way, you concoct, your perfect recipe that you think is perfect, right? So to speak. But the problem is this is kind of an escape route in a way, because it works well when it's small, as we have been. But when you want to scale, then you have to go back into the real world. And so with impact footprint, for instance, we need to make this scale, and we need to interact with larger funders, and we need to be part of these power dynamics. And, I can't tell you the myriads of ways in which these dynamics work. The capital going to the same countries over and over again. It's kind of a herd mentality. Capital going to, those that may have founded by, people by a particular skin color and not others. The capital by default going to networks. Access to networks is a massive one, right? Massive one. to people who know you, or having access. So there are so many ways in which the system, not just the philanthropic system, by the way, the VC system, right, political systems, I mean, every system in a way is systemically uneven, and so in a way you can't really escape from that if you want to effect change. And I don't know the answer. To what extent do you have to compromise your values to become extremely, quote unquote, successful? And of course, it depends on how you define success. So I don't know the answer to that, because we, by the metrics of success of the greater world, we haven't reached that. But by the metrics of success of human change, I think we're doing what we want to do.
Well, that's great to hear. And I mean, it's an unfair question in a way, in that if you could come up with an answer to the question of sort of how you balance pragmatism and working with the world as it is versus sort of idealism and seeing the world in a totally different way, it's not as if we're the first people to struggle with that question.
That's right. Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, it just remains to say, Farahnaz, thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed having the chance to talk. It's been a fascinating conversation. Is there anything that you would like, before you go, just to flag up to people? I'll obviously put links in the show notes to where they can find more details on your work and some of the things that you've written that we've discussed. But is there anything particularly you've got coming up that you'd like to alert people to?
Well, not so much about us. I'm sure you're going to do a good job to represent us. But perhaps I'd like to end on a couple of thoughts I've had lately.
Yeah, of course.
Because we have to interact with, particularly in building impact footprints, many donors, these investors, but also entrepreneurs are doing really unbelievable things in the world. I think it's really important for all of us to remember to be humble, because as we've just said, the system is very top down. But it's important to remember that the challenges are massive in the world, and that all of us are working on little pieces of a much bigger puzzle. And so humility and respect is really critical. And I think if we had more of that in the ecosystem, it would work more fluidly. And it would be less top down. So that's one. And then the second, I think, is, at the entrance of the United Nations in New York, there is a poem by an Iranian poet called Saadi, called Bani Adam. And this poem is really about the essence of humanity. And I think that particularly the current world we live in the last, unfortunate few years, I think we should remind ourselves to, no matter what we do, no matter what tool we use to effect change in the world, or what path we choose, remember to stay compassionate and to keep your heart in the right place. And I think that would take us a long way.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think hugely important things to remember. Yeah, thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast, and wish you all the best with your work. And, perhaps we can catch up at some point in the future and see how things have developed and pick up some of these conversations.
Thank you so much, Roger, for your time.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Farahnaz for finding the time to come on the podcast. Really interesting to talk to her about her work, and great to have a conversation exploring impact investing, because it's not something we've talked about that much on the podcast, and it's something I've done work on in the past, although not for a while. And I think the intersection between that and philanthropy is a really interesting area, so it's great to have a conversation about it. I will put links in the show notes to places where you can find articles and comment pieces that Farahnaz has written that relate to quite a lot of the things that we were talking about in the podcast. I'll also put links to a couple of things that I might have written or other episodes of the podcast that might be of interest. If you're interested more broadly in philanthropy and civil society issues, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. You can also find contact details for me there, where you can get in touch if you've got ideas for people I could talk to on the podcast, or other issues that we could explore, or just in general, if you have thoughts on any of the work of Why Philanthropy Matters. I'd love to hear feedback on that. Other than that, it would be great if you could like, subscribe, do leave a nice review on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you've got friends or colleagues that you think would be interested in the podcast, then please do share it with them. The more the merrier. And other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!